The black twins, Maya and Emma, wave at Officer Timothy Evans every day as he passes by on his patrol. But one morning, when they're not in their usual spot, a sense of dread overwhelms him. Rushing to their house, Timothy is met with a heartbreaking revelation that leaves him in tears, unable to stop crying. What devastating discovery did he uncover that changed everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Timothy Evans guided his patrol car down Maple Street as the morning sun painted the sky in soft pastels. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he approached the familiar yellow house with white trim, number 247. Every morning for the past year, this moment had become the brightest part of his day. The twins, Maya and Emma, would always be there on the porch at exactly 8:45 a.m., their matching dress suits, their smiles, their small hands waving with endless enthusiasm. Their smiles reminded him so much of Sarah, his own little girl who would have been their age now. The thought of Sarah still brought a familiar ache to his chest, but somehow, the twins' daily greeting helped ease that pain just a little. Timothy slowed the car, his eyes already drawn to the usual spot where the girls stood. But today, the wooden porch swing swayed empty in the morning breeze. The windows, usually bright with kitchen activity as Rachel, their mother, prepared breakfast, were dark behind drawn curtains. No cheerful faces pressed against the glass, no tiny hands waving with excitement. Something felt wrong. Timothy had been a cop long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming for attention. He pulled the car to a stop, studying the quiet house. The morning paper still lay untouched at the bottom of the porch steps. Rachel's car sat in the driveway, but there was no sign of life inside the house. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. Usually he could hear the girls' laughter even through his closed car windows, their voices carrying across the neat front lawn as they played their morning games while waiting for the school bus. But today there was nothing. Timothy's throat tightened as memories of another quiet morning flooded back. The morning he lost Sarah. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the worst moments came wrapped in silence. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio, but he forced himself to stay professional, to push back the rising tide of personal fears that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't shake the image of Maya and Emma's usual morning routine. Maya, the more outgoing twin, always leading their enthusiastic greeting, while Emma offered her shy, sweet smile. They had become such a constant in his life, their innocent joy helping to heal wounds he thought would never close. The empty porch felt like a physical blow, stirring up protective instincts that went far beyond his duty as a police officer. Timothy jumped out of his patrol car, his heart pounding against his ribs. He took the porch steps two at a time, the wooden boards creaking under his rushed footsteps. His knuckles rapped sharply against the front door. "Rachel? Maya? Emma?" His voice cracked slightly as he called out their names. The silence that answered made his stomach twist. Cupping his hands around his eyes, he pressed his face to the window beside the door. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see shards of glass scattered across the hardwood floor, glinting in the dim light that filtered through the drawn curtains. "Police, is anyone home?" he shouted, louder this time. Still nothing. With practiced movements, Timothy drew his weapon and kicked the door open. The sharp crack of splintering wood echoed through the quiet house. He entered carefully, scanning the entryway before moving deeper into the home. That's when he saw her. Rachel lay face down on the living room floor, her dark hair spread out like a fan around her head. The furniture had been tossed about, the coffee table on its side, picture frames knocked from the walls, a lamp shattered on the floor. A dark red stain marked the wall behind the overturned sofa. "Rachel?" Timothy holstered his weapon and rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He reached for his radio with shaking hands to call for backup and medical assistance. In the sudden quiet after his radio call, a mechanical voice broke through the silence. "Help me, help me." The sound came from a pink doll lying in the corner, its voice box damaged and repeating the same phrase over and over. Timothy recognized it as Maya's favorite toy, the one she always showed him through the window. "Help me! Help me!" The glitching voice of the doll, the sight of Rachel's unconscious form, the obvious signs of violence, it was too much. Images of finding Sarah's empty bed, that terrible morning years ago, flooded his mind. The same helplessness, the same fear, the same crushing weight of failure pressed down on him. Timothy's legs gave out and he sank to his knees beside Rachel. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. The doll's haunting plea continued to echo through the room. "Help me. Help me." 2 little girls were missing. 2 innocent children who had helped heal his broken heart with their daily waves and bright smiles. And just like with Sarah, he hadn't been there to protect them when they needed him most. The wail of sirens pierced the morning quiet. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows as paramedics rushed into the house, their boots thundering against the wooden floor. Timothy stepped back, watching them work with practiced efficiency as they checked Rachel's vital signs and carefully placed her on a stretcher. "BP is low, possible concussion," one paramedic called out, securing Rachel's neck with a brace. "We need to move her now." Timothy's police training kicked in, helping him push through his emotional turmoil. As the ambulance pulled away, he began searching the house, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to the twins. In the master bedroom, clothes were strewn across the floor, drawers pulled open and emptied. Someone had been searching for something. On the dresser, a silver picture frame lay face down. Timothy picked it up, his hand still trembling slightly. The photo showed Rachel, Michael, and the twins at what looked like a beach picnic. The girls' matching sundresses fluttered in the wind as they built sandcastles. Rachel and Michael sat behind them, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. When Timothy turned the frame over, his breath caught in his throat. Scrawled in hasty black ink across the back of the photo were 4 words: "The debt is paid." He stared at the message, his mind racing back to Michael's death 2 years ago. The official report had ruled it an accident, a car crash on a rainy night. But something about those words made Timothy's police instincts tingle. He remembered the rumors about Michael's business dealings, whispers of high-stakes investments and dangerous partners. Timothy sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph trembling in his hands. What kind of debt could lead to this? Why take the twins? The pieces were there, but they didn't fit together yet. All he knew was that Rachel's unconscious form and those 4 haunting words were somehow connected to Michael's death. Timothy closed his eyes, trying to focus. There had to be more clues, more answers. Rachel would need protection at the hospital, and he needed to find those girls before it was too late. Timothy walked down the quiet suburban street, knocking on doors. Most neighbors weren't home or hadn't noticed anything unusual. His heart felt heavier with each empty lead until he reached the house directly across from Rachel's. Mrs. Andrews, a retired teacher in her 70s, opened the door still wearing her morning robe. Her eyes widened with concern when she saw Timothy's badge. "Officer Evans, is everything all right? I saw the ambulance earlier." She wrung her hands nervously. "Mrs. Andrews, I need to know if you noticed anything unusual last night or this morning." Timothy pulled out his notepad, trying to keep his hand steady. "Well," she stepped onto her porch, lowering her voice. "There was this black car, one of those fancy ones with the dark windows. It was parked across the street for hours last night." Timothy's pen froze mid-sentence. "What time did you first notice it?" "Around 8, I think. I was watching my evening shows when I saw the headlights." She pointed to Rachel's house. "It was still there when I went to bed at 11. The detail hit Timothy hard. He thought of another black car from years ago, the one that had taken his daughter Sarah from the park. The memory of her red coat disappearing into the dark vehicle still haunted his dreams. "Did you see anyone get in or out of the car?" His voice cracked slightly. Mrs. Andrews shook her head. "No, but—" She hesitated. "I heard children crying very early this morning. I thought it was just the twins having a nightmare. Oh God, should I have checked on them?" Timothy touched her shoulder gently. "You couldn't have known, Mrs. Andrews. Every detail helps." Back in his patrol car, Timothy gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The similarities to Sarah's case were overwhelming. The black car, the children's cries, the morning discovery. But this time would be different. This time he wouldn't fail. "I promise I'll find you," he whispered, thinking of Maya and Emma's smiling faces at the window. The memory of their daily waves, their innocent trust in him as their protector, strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't let another family experience the pain he had lived with for the past 5 years. Timothy pulled out his phone to call for backup. This wasn't just another missing persons case anymore. For him, it was personal. A chance to save not only Maya and Emma, but perhaps a small part of himself too. Later that afternoon, the hospital corridor buzzed with activity, but Timothy barely noticed as he rushed toward Rachel's room. The rhythmic beeping of machines guided him to where she lay, her face pale against the stark white pillows. His heart ached at the sight of the bruises darkening her cheek and temple. A nurse was checking Rachel's vitals when her eyelids began to flutter. Timothy moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Rachel," he said softly. "It's Officer Evans. You're safe now." Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. The nurse adjusted the bed so Rachel could sit up slightly, then quietly left the room. Rachel's gaze darted around frantically until it settled on Timothy. "My girls," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "My babies." "I'm here to help," Timothy said, keeping his voice gentle. "Can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for the water cup beside her bed. Timothy helped her take a small sip, noting how her fingers shook against the plastic. "They came," she started, then winced in pain. "In the night. I tried to stop them." Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "Who came, Rachel? Please, anything you can remember will help." Her eyes grew distant, clouded with fear and medication. "They took them," she mumbled, her words slurring slightly. "Because of him." "Because of who?" Timothy leaned closer, his heart pounding. "Michael." The name came out as barely a breath. "His fault. All his fault." Timothy's mind raced back to the photograph, the mysterious note about a debt. Michael's death hadn't been an accident after all. It was all connected. "Rachel, I promise you," Timothy said, carefully taking her hand. "I will find Maya and Emma. I won't stop until they're back home with you." But Rachel's eyes had already closed, her medication pulling her back into unconsciousness. Her hand went limp in his, but her words echoed in his mind. They took them. Because of him. Timothy stood there for a moment, watching Rachel's chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. The machines continued their steady beeping, marking time in a race he couldn't afford to lose. Timothy's footsteps echoed through the quiet precinct as he made his way to Captain Morrison's office. His tie felt too tight, his collar suffocating, but he couldn't shake the image of those empty beds where Maya and Emma should have been sleeping. He knocked on the captain's door, his knuckles white with tension. "Come in, Evans." Captain Morrison sat behind his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as Timothy entered, his expression already wary. "I need access to Michael Wheeler's case files," Timothy said, cutting straight to the point. "His death wasn't an accident. It's connected to the twins' kidnapping." The captain leaned back in his chair, studying Timothy's face. "That case was closed 2 years ago. What makes you think there's a connection?" Timothy pulled out the photograph with its ominous message. "Found this at the scene. The debt is paid." Something from Michael's past came back to haunt his family. "Tim," the captain's voice softened, "I know this case hits close to home. Those girls remind you of Sarah." "This isn't about Sarah," Timothy interrupted, though his throat tightened at his daughter's name. "Rachel's in the hospital. Her girls are missing. We need to move fast." Captain Morrison removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "You're too personally invested. Maybe Detective Rodriguez should—" "Please," Timothy's voice cracked. "I promised Rachel. I can't—" He steadied himself against the desk. "I can't fail another child." The silence in the office felt heavy, broken only by the distant ringing of phones and shuffling of papers outside. "All right," the captain finally said, reaching for his computer. "I'll grant you access. But Tim?" He fixed him with a stern look. "Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. These girls need clear thinking, not guilt-driven decisions." Timothy nodded, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, sir." "And Evans?" the captain called as Timothy turned to leave. "Be careful. If Michael's death wasn't an accident, you could be stepping into something dangerous." But Timothy was already heading toward the records room, his mind racing with possibilities. He wouldn't rest until he understood what Michael had been involved in. He owed it to those little girls who used to wave at him every morning. He owed it to Rachel, lying broken in that hospital bed. And maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself too. Timothy spread Michael Wheeler's files across his desk, the fluorescent lights of the precinct casting harsh shadows on the photographs and documents. His coffee grew cold beside him as he immersed himself in the details of Michael's life. The first few pages painted a picture of success. Michael had worked as a business consultant for several high-profile companies in the city. But as Timothy dug deeper, troubling patterns emerged. Multiple consulting contracts with companies that had faced fraud investigations. Financial statements that didn't quite add up. One name kept appearing in the files, Victor Hale. Timothy recognized it immediately. Everyone in the city knew about the wealthy businessman. Hale's company had been involved in several controversial developments, but nothing ever stuck to him. He was like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. Timothy pulled up an old newspaper article on his computer. There it was, a photo of Michael and Victor at a charity gala, both men smiling for the camera. But Timothy noticed Michael's tension in the image, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. "What were you mixed up in, Michael?" Timothy muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. He found a memo dated 3 months before Michael's death. It was a draft of a letter addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing suspicious activities within Hale's organization. The letter was never sent. Timothy's heart began to race as he connected the dots. 2 weeks after the draft was written, Michael had died in what was ruled a car accident. And now, 2 years later, his twin daughters were missing. He pulled out his phone and searched for recent news about Victor Hale. The businessman had been fighting accusations of financial misconduct, but a key piece of evidence had gone missing. The timing couldn't be coincidental. "The debt is paid," Timothy whispered, remembering the note left at Rachel's house. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. Could Hale have discovered that Michael had kept evidence of his wrongdoings? Evidence that Rachel might have found? The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that made Timothy's stomach churn. Victor Hale had a reputation for being ruthless in business. How far would he go to protect himself? Timothy gathered the most relevant documents into a folder, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. The twins' faces flashed in his mind, their innocent waves, their bright smiles. If Hale had them, every minute counted. The next day, Timothy sat across from David Chen in a quiet coffee shop downtown. David had worked with Michael for 5 years at the consulting firm, and his nervous fidgeting with his coffee cup spoke volumes. "Michael changed in those last few months," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd always been meticulous with his work, but suddenly he was staying late, triple-checking everything. Sometimes I'd find him in his office at dawn, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Timothy leaned forward, noting how David's eyes darted around the coffee shop. What was he working on? He never said directly. David took a shaky sip of his coffee. But one night, after everyone had left, he called me into his office. He was pale, Timothy, scared. He showed me some numbers that didn't add up in one of Hale's offshore accounts. Timothy's pulse quickened. Did he tell you what he found? No. David shook his head. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. But the next day, he had this massive fight with Victor in the conference room. The whole floor could hear them shouting. Victor stormed out and Michael... David's voice cracked. Michael packed up his office that same day. Timothy pulled out his notebook, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Did Michael say anything else? David glanced over his shoulder before continuing. The last time I saw him, he mentioned leaving something for Rachel, said if anything happened to him, she'd know what to do. David's hands trembled as he set down his cup. A week later, he was dead. The weight of David's words settled heavily on Timothy's shoulders. This wasn't just about the twins anymore. This was about secrets worth killing for, about a man who'd tried to protect his family from something dangerous enough to get him killed. Michael wasn't just afraid for himself, was he? Timothy asked quietly. He was afraid for Rachel and the girls. David nodded slowly. The day after the fight with Victor, I overheard Michael on the phone with Rachel. He was telling her where to find something important, something she needed to protect. David's voice dropped even lower. He said if anything ever happened to him, she needed to keep it safe, that it was their insurance. Timothy felt a chill run down his spine as the pieces clicked into place. Michael hadn't just stumbled upon something in Victor's accounts. He'd gathered evidence. Evidence that Rachel now had. Evidence that Victor was desperate to find. The twins weren't just kidnapping victims, they were leverage. Timothy hunched over his desk, his tired eyes fixed on the grainy security footage from the traffic cameras. Coffee cups littered his workspace, testament to the hours he'd spent reviewing the recordings. His finger hovered over the pause button as a black sedan glided across the screen at 11:42 p.m. "Got you," he whispered, zooming in on the vehicle. The car matched Mrs. Andrews' description perfectly, a black Lincoln Continental with tinted windows. He rewound the footage several times, his heart pounding as he finally caught a clear shot of the license plate, KRX 4891. His fingers flew across the keyboard, running the plate through the department's database. The results made his breath catch. The car was registered to Marcus Weber, a name Timothy recognized from Victor's case files. Weber had been Victor's driver for the past decade, handling more than just transportation according to the notes. Within an hour, Timothy stood outside Weber's apartment building in the industrial district. The concrete walls were stained with age, and a flickering street lamp cast uncertain shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Timothy took the stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor. Weber opened the door on the second knock. He was shorter than Timothy expected, with close-cropped gray hair and cold eyes that gave nothing away. "Marcus Weber?" Timothy held up his badge. "Detective Evans, I need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts last night." Weber's face remained expressionless. "I was home. Your car was spotted near Cedar Grove around midnight." Timothy watched for any reaction, but Weber's face stayed as still as stone. "2 little girls went missing from there last night, twin 6-year-olds. "That's terrible," Weber said flatly, "but I can't help you." "We have footage of your car, Marcus." Timothy stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I know you work for Victor Hale. I know about Michael's investigation into his accounts." Weber's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough to confirm Timothy's suspicions. Then the mask slipped back into place. "If you have any actual evidence, Detective, you can talk to my lawyer." Weber's hand moved to close the door. Timothy blocked it with his foot. "Those girls are innocent, Marcus. Whatever Victor's holding over you, it's not worth this." For a brief moment, something like regret crossed Weber's features. Then his face hardened again, and he said nothing more, stepping back and shutting the door firmly in Timothy's face. Timothy stood in the dim hallway, his fists clenched. Weber's silence told him more than words could have. He was on the right track, but Victor's people wouldn't break easily. He'd need more than just traffic camera footage to save the twins. That evening, Timothy entered Rachel's hospital room, his footsteps quiet on the linoleum floor. She looked better than the last time he'd seen her. Some color had returned to her cheeks, though dark circles still shadowed her eyes. When she saw him, she tried to sit up straighter against the pillows. "The twins?" she asked immediately, her voice hoarse. Timothy shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm getting closer, Rachel. I need you to tell me everything you know." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes. She twisted the thin hospital blanket between her fingers. "I should have known this would happen. Michael warned me." Warned you about what? Victor Hale. Rachel's voice cracked. Michael was investigating him, looking into his business dealings. He found something, documents, records that proved Victor had been stealing millions through fake companies. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. But it was more than that. The money was connected to terrible things, Detective. Things that could put Victor away for life. Timothy leaned forward in his chair. Where are these documents now? I don't know exactly. Rachel's hands trembled. Michael hid everything before he died. He told me there was a fortune in offshore accounts, Victor's dirty money that he'd traced. He said the evidence was our insurance policy, that it would keep us safe if anything happened to him. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I thought after Michael's accident, Victor would leave us alone, that maybe he didn't know about the evidence. But now he's coming after it through the twins, Timothy said softly. Rachel broke down, her shoulders shaking with sobs. This is all my fault. I should have moved us away, changed our names. Michael left me clues about where he hid everything, but I was too scared to look. I thought if I just kept quiet, kept my head down. She covered her face with her hands. And now my babies are gone. Timothy reached out and gently touched her arm. Rachel, look at me. He waited until she lowered her hands. I'm going to find them, but I need to know everything Michael told you about those clues. Rachel wiped her eyes. He said the answer was in our wedding album, something about the dates and places being important. She took a deep breath. The album is hidden in a false bottom of my bedroom closet. I never looked at it after he died. I couldn't. I'll find it, Timothy promised. His determination burned stronger than ever, fueled by Rachel's pain and the knowledge that they were finally getting closer to the truth. We're going to make this right. The following day, Timothy stood in Captain Morris's office, his hands planted firmly on the desk as he laid out everything he'd learned from Rachel. The captain's face remained impassive, his expression growing more skeptical with each detail Timothy shared. So let me get this straight, Captain Morris said, leaning back in his chair. You think Victor Hale, one of the most respected businessmen in this city, kidnapped 2 little girls over some supposed evidence that may or may not exist? Rachel's testimony is from a traumatized woman who just went through a terrible ordeal, the captain cut in. Evans, you're letting your personal feelings cloud your judgment here. Timothy felt his jaw tighten. Sir, with all due respect, the evidence is adding up. The black car belonged to one of Victor's associates. Rachel's statement about the documents is circumstantial at best. Captain Morris stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Listen, Timothy. I know this case hits close to home for you, but you need to be careful here. Victor Hale isn't someone you want to antagonize without rock-solid proof. Something in the captain's tone made Timothy pause. He studied the older man's face, the careful neutrality, the slight tension around his eyes. Are you telling me to back off this investigation, sir? I'm telling you to stick to protocol. Focus on finding the girls through official channels. Leave Victor Hale out of it unless you have concrete evidence. Timothy straightened up slowly. Even if those official channels might be compromised? The captain's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation, Detective. It's not an accusation, sir, just an observation. Timothy turned toward the door, his mind already made up. Thank you for your time. Evans. The captain's voice stopped him. Don't do anything stupid. Victor Hale has a lot of friends in this city. Powerful friends. Timothy nodded without turning around. I understand perfectly, sir. He walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. As he passed the bullpen, he noticed several officers quickly averting their eyes. The captain's warning rang in his ears, but instead of fear, he felt a cold clarity settling over him. Back at his desk, Timothy began gathering his files. He couldn't trust the department resources anymore, not with Victor's influence potentially reaching into the force itself. He'd have to work this case alone, off the books. He looked at the photo of Maya and Emma on his desk, their innocent smiles tearing at his heart. He wouldn't fail them like he'd failed his own daughter. No matter what it cost him, he would find those girls and bring them home. Timothy packed up his files and walked out of the precinct, ignoring the whispers that followed him. The weight of going rogue should have terrified him, but instead he felt lighter. No more red tape, no more politics. Just him, following the truth wherever it led. Later that day, Timothy sat in his car outside a coffee shop, surrounded by property records and satellite images he'd printed. His fingers traced over a map of Victor's holdings, marking each location with meticulous care. Most were obvious: office buildings, warehouses, and luxury homes scattered throughout the city. But one property stood out: an old estate on Willow Creek Road, tucked away behind acres of overgrown land. The records showed minimal utility usage, yet security cameras had been installed 6 months ago. Timothy circled it with a red pen, his gut telling him this wasn't just another empty investment. His phone buzzed, an unknown number lighting up the screen. Timothy hesitated before answering. "Evans speaking?" "Detective." The voice was distorted, clearly using some kind of modifier. "I have information about Victor Hale that you need to hear." Timothy sat up straighter, grabbing his notepad. "Who is this?" "Names aren't important. What matters is that I know about the underground network Victor uses to move people and products." The caller paused. "There's a system of tunnels connecting several properties on the east side. They were built during Prohibition, but Victor's been using them for years." "How do you know this?" Timothy's hand tightened around his pen. "Because I helped maintain them. The main access point is through the wine cellar at the Willow Creek estate. There's a hidden door behind the third rack from the left wall." The caller's voice grew urgent. "Victor doesn't just use these tunnels for smuggling goods anymore. He started moving people." Timothy's heart raced as he scribbled down the details. "The twins, are they?" "I can't say more, but detective." The voice softened slightly. "Be careful. The tunnels are monitored and Victor has eyes everywhere. You'll only get one chance." The line went dead. Timothy stared at his phone, then back at the circled estate on his map. The pieces were falling into place. The isolated location, the new security system, the hidden underground network. It was the perfect place to hold 2 little girls without anyone knowing. He spread out a detailed blueprint of the area, studying the topography and possible entry points. The caller's warning about monitoring systems meant he'd need to be smart about this. One wrong move, and he might not only lose his chance to save the twins, but also put them in even more danger. Timothy began making notes, mapping out potential approaches. He'd need to verify the information first, but if the caller was right about the tunnels, it could be the break he'd been desperately searching for. Hours later, the informant's next message came through as coordinates, leading Timothy to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. The building's metal walls were streaked with rust, and broken windows gaped like missing teeth against the gray afternoon sky. Timothy's hand rested on his service weapon as he approached the side entrance. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, dust motes danced in thin shafts of light that pierced through the holes in the roof. The space smelled of mold and neglect, making Timothy's nose wrinkle as he clicked on his flashlight. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the empty space. No answer came. Following the beam of his flashlight, Timothy moved deeper into the warehouse. Wooden crates and old machinery cast long shadows across the concrete floor. In the center of the room, something caught his eye: a small cardboard box placed deliberately on top of a metal drum. Timothy's hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, lying on a bed of crumpled newspaper, were items that made his heart clench. A pink hair ribbon, the one Maya had worn every day since her father's death. Next to it was Emma's worn stuffed penguin, Mr. Waddles, its black button eyes staring up at him. "Oh, girls," Timothy whispered, picking up the ribbon. He could still see Maya's proud smile as she showed him how she'd learned to tie it herself. The silk felt soft between his fingers, a stark contrast to the rough surroundings. He lifted Mr. Waddles carefully, noting the dark smudges on its white belly, probably from being dragged across a dirty floor. Emma never went anywhere without this penguin. She must have been terrified to have it taken away. Timothy sank to his knees, clutching the small treasures to his chest. These weren't just pieces of evidence. They were pieces of Maya and Emma's childhood, torn away from them. The items proved they were alive, but they also showed the girls were scared and separated from their comfort objects. "I'm coming," he promised quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on a little longer." Looking at his watch, Timothy realized another day was slipping away. Each hour that passed felt like sand through an hourglass, time he couldn't afford to waste. But these items gave him hope. They were breadcrumbs leading him closer to the twins. He placed the ribbon and stuffed penguin carefully into evidence bags, documenting their location with photographs. These precious items would help build his case, but more importantly, they strengthened his resolve. Maya and Emma were out there, waiting for someone to find them. Timothy refused to let them down the way he'd failed his own daughter years ago. Timothy sat in his parked car outside the warehouse, still holding the evidence bags with the twins' belongings, when a sharp knock on his window made him jump. A young man in his late 20s stood there, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rundown surroundings. "Detective Evans?" The man's voice was hushed but urgent. "I'm Alex Hale. We need to talk about my father." Timothy's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but something in Alex's eyes, a mixture of fear and determination, made him pause. He stepped out of the car, keeping a careful distance. "Victor Hale is your father?" Timothy studied the younger man's face, noting the familiar, sharp features that marked him as Victor's son. Alex nodded, running a hand through his dark hair. "Look, I know what he's done. The twins, Maya and Emma, he's using them to get to Rachel." His voice cracked slightly. "She has evidence that could destroy him. Evidence my father's been hunting for years." "What kind of evidence?" Timothy asked, his heart racing at this unexpected breakthrough. "Documents, recordings, proof of everything illegal he's done. Michael gathered it all before—" Alex trailed off, glancing around nervously. "Dad thinks Rachel knows where it's hidden. He's using the girls as leverage." Timothy's fists clenched at his sides. "Where are they, Alex?" "There's a safe house about an hour outside town. It's where he keeps things he doesn't want anyone to find." Alex pulled out his phone and showed Timothy a map. "It's an old hunting lodge on private land. Security cameras, guards, the works. But I know the rotation schedules, the blind spots." "Why are you helping us?" Timothy asked, searching Alex's face for any sign of deception. Alex's shoulders slumped. "Because I was 12 when I watched him destroy my first family. My mom." He swallowed hard. "She tried to leave him, to protect me. He made sure she lost everything. Her reputation, her family, even custody of me. I can't watch him do it again, not to those little girls." Timothy saw the pain in Alex's eyes, raw and genuine. It was the look of someone who'd carried a heavy burden for far too long. "The guards change shifts at midnight," Alex continued, his voice steadier now. "There's a service road that isn't monitored. I can draw you a layout of the building, show you where they're likely keeping the twins." He pulled out a small notebook and began sketching, his hands shaking slightly. "Just promise me something, Detective. When you go in, don't let him know I helped. He can't know I was involved." Timothy watched as Alex detailed the security measures, the entry points, the guard positions. Each piece of information brought him closer to Maya and Emma, closer to making things right. After carefully planning the operation that evening, Timothy and Alex crouched behind thick bushes at the edge of the property, watching the safe house through binoculars. The old hunting lodge sat dark and imposing against the evening sky, its windows mostly shuttered except for a faint light on the second floor. "There," Alex whispered, pointing to a black SUV pulling up to the front. "That's Jensen, my father's head of security. He only shows up when there's something important to protect." Timothy's heart tightened as he watched two armed men exit the vehicle and do a perimeter check. Through his binoculars, he could see their professional movements, the way they systematically covered every angle. These weren't ordinary thugs, they were trained professionals. "How many men inside?" Timothy asked, his voice barely audible. "Usually 4 plus Jensen." Alex checked his watch. "They rotate every 6 hours. The next shift change is at midnight." Timothy pulled out the rough layout Alex had drawn earlier, studying it in the dim light of dusk. The service entrance at the back seemed like the best entry point, but the timing had to be perfect. His hand moved to his phone, thumb hovering over the number for dispatch. "You can't call it in," Alex said, reading his thoughts. "My father has too many people in his pocket. The twins would be gone before backup arrived." Timothy knew Alex was right, but going in alone against 5 armed men felt like suicide. The memory of Rachel in the hospital bed flashed through his mind, followed by the image of his own daughter. He couldn't fail another child. Not again. "What about the local police?" Timothy asked, though he already knew the answer. Alex shook his head. "Dad's been buying influence in this county for decades. We can't trust anyone we don't know personally." They watched as Jensen disappeared inside the building. A few minutes later, the light on the second floor flickered, and Timothy caught a glimpse of movement behind the curtains. His breath caught in his throat as a small shadow passed by the window, just the right size for a 6-year-old girl. "They're alive," he whispered, relief and fear mixing in his chest. "But we need to move fast." Timothy began mentally calculating his options. He had his service weapon and 2 spare magazines. His bulletproof vest was in the trunk of his car. Going in alone would be dangerous, but waiting could be worse. Victor's men could move the twins at any time, and then the trail would go cold. "I could create a distraction," Alex offered. "Draw some of the guards away while you go in through the back." Timothy studied the young man's face, seeing both determination and fear there. "That would put you at risk. Your father—" "I've been hiding from his anger my whole life," Alex interrupted. "Maybe it's time I stopped running. Those girls are innocent." Timothy looked back at the house, weighing each possibility against the precious lives at stake. The wrong choice could cost the twins everything, but doing nothing wasn't an option either. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. Timothy and Alex put their plan into motion as darkness settled over the property. Alex drove his car toward the front gate, deliberately stalling it and creating a commotion that drew 2 of the guards' attention. Meanwhile, Timothy slipped around to the service entrance, his heart pounding against his Kevlar vest. The lock gave way easily, too easily. A whisper of doubt crept into Timothy's mind, but the thought of the twins pushed him forward. The hallway was dark and quiet, his footsteps muffled on the old carpet. He made his way upstairs, following the path to where they'd seen the light earlier. The silence felt wrong. No voices, no movement, no signs of children being held against their will. Just emptiness. When he reached the second floor, Timothy found the room with the window they'd watched. Inside, a single lamp cast shadows on the wall, and a small electric fan gently moved the curtains, creating the shadows they'd seen from outside. On a table sat a child's sweater that he recognized as Maya's. "Looking for someone, Detective Evans?" A man's voice crackled through a speaker mounted in the corner. "I'm afraid you're too late." Timothy's blood ran cold. Before he could react, gunfire erupted from both ends of the hallway. He dove into the room, bullets splintering the doorframe where he'd stood seconds before. "Alex!" Timothy shouted into his radio. "It's a trap! Get out!" He heard shouting from outside, followed by the screech of tires. At least Alex had escaped. Timothy pressed himself against the wall, breathing hard. He'd walked right into Victor's hands, and now the twins could be anywhere. The shooting stopped, replaced by heavy footsteps approaching. Timothy spotted a narrow window leading to the roof of a lower section. It was his only chance. He fired several shots to keep the men back, then crashed through the window, rolling onto the slanted roof below. Pain shot through his shoulder as he tumbled down the shingles, barely catching himself at the edge. Bullets pinged off the roof around him as he dropped to the ground, landing hard but managing to stay on his feet. Timothy ran into the woods, zigzagging between trees as shots followed him. He didn't stop until he reached the backup car they'd hidden a quarter mile away. Alex was already there, his face pale with worry. They drove in silence for several minutes, the weight of their failure settling heavily between them. Finally, Timothy pulled over, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. "I should have known," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Victor was playing us the whole time. He knew we were watching." He slammed his palm against the dashboard. I failed them. Just like I failed my daughter. The memory of Maya's sweater deliberately placed for him to find felt like a mockery of his efforts. Victor had orchestrated everything, proving just how far behind they really were. Timothy felt the familiar grip of helplessness tightening around his chest, wondering if he was truly capable of bringing these girls home safely. Timothy's footsteps echoed through the quiet precinct hallway as he made his way to his desk, his body aching from the earlier escape. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his weary face. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the roof, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. As he approached his desk, he noticed a plain white envelope sitting in the center. His name was written across it in neat block letters. With trembling fingers, he tore it open, his heart skipping a beat as he unfolded the paper inside. One more step and they disappear forever. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He sank into his chair, the paper crumpling in his grip. The precinct's usual buzz of activity faded away as memories flooded his mind. Maya and Emma's cheerful waves from their porch, their small faces pressed against the window waiting for his patrol car to pass by. Then Rachel's face appeared in his thoughts, pale and frightened in her hospital bed, trusting him to bring her daughters home. The image of her desperate eyes cut through his despair like a knife. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't fail another child. Not again. Timothy smoothed out the crumpled note, studying it more carefully. Victor was trying to scare him off, which meant he was getting close. The thought sparked something inside him. Not hope exactly, but determination. A fierce, unwavering resolve that pushed back against the crushing weight of failure. He pulled out his phone and dialed Rachel's hospital room. When she answered, her voice was weak but alert. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We thought we had them, but—" "Are you giving up?" Rachel interrupted, her words barely above a whisper. "No," Timothy replied firmly, straightening in his chair. "Never. I promised you I'd bring them home, and I will." There was a pause before Rachel spoke again. "They're all I have, Timothy, please." "I know," he said softly, remembering the sound of his own daughter's laughter. "I won't stop until they're safe. That's a promise I intend to keep." He hung up the phone and looked at the threatening note again. Victor thought he could scare him away with threats, but he'd already lost everything once before. He had nothing left to lose, and 2 little girls were counting on him. Timothy pinned the note to his bulletin board, right next to the photo of Maya and Emma from their house. Their smiling faces stared back at him, and he felt his resolve harden into steel. Victor might have won this round, but Timothy wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Rachel stirred in her hospital bed, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. The evening sun cast long shadows through the window, warming her pale face as Timothy sat beside her. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, but now there was a new alertness in her gaze. "I remembered something," she said, her voice stronger than before. "About Michael. About the last time I saw him." Timothy leaned forward, his heart beating faster. "What is it, Rachel?" She closed her eyes as if watching a scene play out in her mind. "The day before he died, he took the girls to their special place, a fort they built together in the woods behind Old Creek Trail." Her voice cracked with emotion. "When he came home that night, he told me that if anything ever happened, to remember that spot. He said it was their secret place. Only he and the girls knew about it." Timothy's breath caught in his throat. "Did he say anything else about this fort?" Rachel nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "He made it into a game with the twins. They had a special knock, a secret password. The girls loved it so much." She grabbed Timothy's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Maya and Emma never told anyone else about it. Not even me. It was their special thing with their daddy." Timothy felt his pulse quicken as the pieces started falling into place. "This could be it," he said softly. "Michael might have hidden something there, something important enough that Victor would take the girls to find it." "The girls would know how to find it," Rachel whispered, realization dawning on her face. "That's why they took them both. They need them to locate the fort." Timothy stood up, energy coursing through his body. This was the break they needed. "Can you describe where on Old Creek Trail they used to go?" Rachel nodded, sitting up straighter despite her weakness. "There's an old oak tree with a lightning scar about half a mile down the trail. Michael said they built the fort just past that, hidden in a cluster of pine trees." "A place only the twins would know," Timothy repeated, his mind racing. A place where Michael could have hidden anything he wanted to keep from Victor. He squeezed Rachel's hand gently. "This might be exactly what we've been looking for." Timothy led the way through the darkening woods, with Alex and Jack Martinez, a retired officer he'd known for 20 years, following close behind. The fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they made their way deeper into the forest. The setting sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like ghostly fingers. "The oak tree should be around here somewhere," Timothy whispered, his eyes scanning the tree line. His flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, searching for the lightning scar Rachel had described. As they walked, memories of his daughter Sarah flooded his mind. She had been just a year older than the twins when he lost her. The weight of that failure had haunted him every day since. He remembered her small hand in his, her trust in him absolute, just like Maya and Emma's innocent waves from their porch each morning. "You okay, Tim?" Jack asked, noticing his friend's distant expression. Timothy nodded, swallowing hard. "I keep thinking about Sarah," he admitted quietly. "I couldn't save her then, but these girls—" He paused, steadying his voice. "These girls still have a chance." Alex moved closer, his own flashlight beam joining Timothy's. "We're going to find them," he said with quiet determination. "My father won't win this time." They pressed on through the thickening woods, the branches growing denser overhead. Timothy's muscles ached from the tension he carried, but each step felt purposeful. This wasn't just another case. It was his shot at redemption, a chance to make right what had gone so terribly wrong years ago. "There!" Alex called out suddenly, his light illuminating a massive oak tree. The lightning scar stretched down its trunk like a pale, twisted ribbon. Timothy approached the tree, running his hand over its rough bark. Something stirred in his chest, hope, maybe, or fear, or both. "The fort should be just past here, hidden in the pines," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they carefully made their way around the oak tree, Jack placed a steadying hand on Timothy's shoulder. "Whatever happens next, Tim, you're not alone in this. Not this time." Timothy nodded, grateful for his friend's presence. The guilt and grief he'd carried for so long felt lighter somehow, shared between these two men who stood with him now. This was his chance to be the protector he'd failed to be before, to keep his promise to Rachel and maybe finally, to forgive himself. Through the tangle of pine branches, Timothy spotted it, a simple wooden structure nestled between 3 tall trees. His heart skipped a beat as his flashlight beam caught something fluttering in the evening breeze, a small piece of pink fabric tied to a low branch near the fort's entrance. "Look," he whispered, moving forward carefully. The fort was crude but sturdy, clearly built with a father's loving hands. Empty juice boxes and candy wrappers littered the ground around it, recent signs of life that made Timothy's pulse quicken. Alex kept watch while Jack covered the rear, allowing Timothy to approach the fort. Inside, blankets were strewn about, and a small backpack lay open, its contents partially spilled. Timothy recognized it as Emma's favorite, the one with unicorns that she wore to school every day. His hands trembled as he picked up a piece of cloth near the backpack. It was torn from what looked like Maya's dress, the one she'd been wearing the day they disappeared. Written in wobbly letters with what appeared to be a crayon were 2 simple words: "We're close." "They were here," Timothy said, his voice thick with emotion. "Recently, too. These wrappers are still fresh, and look." He pointed to small footprints in the soft earth. "These can't be more than a few hours old." A twig snapped in the distance, making all 3 men freeze. Jack's hand went to his holster as Alex pressed himself against a tree trunk. The sound of voices carried through the darkness, rough male voices approaching from the north. "Victor's men," Alex breathed, barely audible. They must have followed the same trail we did. Timothy clutched Maya's message in his hand, hope and fear warring in his chest. The twins were alive, they were moving, and they were leaving him clues. His girls, because that's how he'd come to think of them, were proving just how clever they could be. The voices grew closer. Timothy could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, maybe more. They needed to move, and fast, but the evidence in the fort told him they were on the right track. The twins were counting on him just like Sarah had once counted on him. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't fail. Jack signaled toward a dense patch of undergrowth to their west, their best chance of staying hidden while keeping the fort in sight. Timothy nodded, carefully pocketing Maya's message. As they crept away from the fort, he sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the twins' resourcefulness and courage. They were leaving him a trail, and he was going to follow it all the way to them, no matter what it took. The moon cast long shadows across Victor's sprawling estate as Timothy, Alex, and Jack took their positions. The mansion loomed before them, its windows dark except for a faint glow from the basement level. Timothy's heart pounded against his ribs as he checked his weapon one last time. "Remember the layout," Alex whispered, pointing to different sections of the building. "Dad's security will be heaviest near his office on the 2nd floor, but the basement has multiple access points." Timothy nodded, thinking of the twins' frightened faces. "Jack, take the east entrance. Alex, cover the main floor. I'll head down below." The team moved like shadows across the manicured lawn. Timothy reached the basement window they'd identified earlier, his hands steady as he worked it open. The rusty hinges protested softly, but he managed to slip inside without making much noise. The basement corridors twisted like a maze, lit only by emergency lights that cast an eerie glow. Timothy's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he moved forward, checking each room. The musty air felt thick in his lungs. "Maya? Emma?" he called out softly, straining to hear any response. The silence that followed made his stomach knot. He turned another corner past what looked like a wine cellar. The corridor branched in 3 directions. Timothy paused, listening intently. Then he heard it, a small sound like a muffled whimper. "Maya? Emma?" he called again, a little louder this time. "Officer Timothy?" A tiny voice responded, barely audible but unmistakably Emma's. His heart leaped. "Keep talking, sweetie, I'm coming." "We're here." Maya's voice joined her sister's, stronger but still distant. "In the dark room." Timothy moved faster now, following their voices. The corridor seemed endless, each turn revealing another stretch of darkness. But the twins kept calling out, their voices growing clearer. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking another empty room. "No," Emma replied, "but we're scared." "I know, sweetheart, I'm almost there. Keep talking to me." Their voices led him down one final corridor. He could hear them clearly now, their words muffled by what sounded like a heavy door. Timothy's flashlight beam revealed a steel door at the end of the hallway. "Maya, Emma, are you behind this door?" "Yes," they cried in unison. Timothy's hand touched the cold metal, his determination stronger than ever. The twins were just on the other side, counting on him. This time, he wouldn't let them down. This time, he would save them. Timothy examined the heavy steel door, his heart racing. The lock was electronic, requiring a key card. Without hesitation, he pulled out the security card Alex had given him and swiped it. The light turned green with a soft beep. He yanked the door open and there they were, Maya and Emma huddled together on a small cot in the corner. Their faces lit up at the sight of him, tears streaming down their cheeks. "Officer Timothy!" they cried in unison, jumping up and running into his arms. Timothy dropped to his knees, wrapping them both in a tight embrace. His own eyes welled with tears as he held them close, feeling their small bodies trembling against him. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." "We knew you'd find us," Maya said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "We left clues just like you taught us," Emma added, looking up at him with trust in her eyes. The tender moment was shattered by slow, deliberate applause echoing through the corridor. Timothy's body tensed as he turned, keeping the girls behind him. Victor Hale stood at the end of the hallway, flanked by 4 armed guards. "How touching," Victor said, his voice cold and smooth as ice. "The hero officer saves the day. Though I must say, I expected you sooner." Timothy's hand moved to his weapon, but Victor's guards already had their guns trained on him. The twins clutched his jacket tightly. "It's over, Victor," Timothy said firmly. "I know about everything. The fraud, the murders, all of it. Michael's evidence didn't disappear when you killed him." Victor's composed expression flickered for just a moment. "And where exactly is this supposed evidence?" "In a safe place," Timothy replied, standing his ground. "One phone call from me, and it goes straight to the FBI, unless these girls and I walk out of here right now." The air crackled with tension as Victor considered his options. Timothy could feel Maya and Emma trembling behind him, but he kept his eyes locked on Victor. "You're bluffing," Victor said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Timothy reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Should we find out?" "One call, Victor. That's all it takes to bring your whole world crashing down." Victor's face contorted with rage as his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, and his eyes widened in disbelief. On the screen, a live broadcast was playing. Documents, recordings, and photographs streaming across social media platforms. Everything Michael had collected was now public. "No," Victor whispered, his composure cracking. "No, no, no." Timothy allowed himself a small smile. "My friend at the station just released everything. Michael was smarter than you thought, Victor. He made copies, lots of them. The evidence was never just in one place." The guards looked uncertainly at each other as their phones started buzzing too. The news was spreading like wildfire. Victor's crimes, the fraud, the murders, the corruption, all laid bare for the world to see. "Kill them!" Victor screamed, his face twisted with desperation. "Kill them all!" But before the guards could act, Alex stepped out from behind them, his gun trained on his father. "Drop your weapons," he ordered the guards. "It's over, Dad." The guards, seeing their employer's empire crumbling in real time, lowered their weapons. Victor spun to face his son, his eyes wild with betrayal. "You," he snarled, "my own flesh and blood." "Someone had to stop you," Alex said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I watched you destroy lives for years. I won't let you hurt these children like you hurt me." Victor lunged for Alex's gun, moving with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. But Alex was ready. He sidestepped his father's attack and tackled him to the ground, pinning him there as Timothy rushed forward with handcuffs. "Victor Hale," Timothy said, securing the cuffs around Victor's wrists. "You're under arrest for the murder of Michael Stevens and multiple other charges." He could feel Maya and Emma watching from behind him, still holding on to each other for support. Victor struggled and spat threats, but his words held no power anymore. On every phone in the building, the evidence continued to stream, dismantling his carefully constructed world piece by piece. The truth about Michael's death, the covered-up accidents, the blackmail, everything he had buried was now exposed to the light. Alex stood over his father, tears running down his face. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, "but this is who you really are, and I couldn't live with myself if I let you hurt anyone else." Timothy dropped to his knees, his arms opening wide to receive them. The twins crashed into his embrace with such force that he nearly fell backward. "We knew you'd come," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Officer Evans." Timothy held them tight, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. Tears streamed down his face as he breathed in their presence, alive and safe. The weight of the past few days, the fear, the desperate search, the memories of his own loss, began to lift from his shoulders. Moments later, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the hallway. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her hospital gown replaced with borrowed clothes, her face pale but determined. When she saw her daughters, she let out a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "My babies," she cried, rushing forward to join them. Timothy opened the circle of his arms wider, and Rachel fell to her knees beside them, gathering all three into her embrace. Maya and Emma's small hands reached for their mother, their tears of fear turning to tears of joy. "Mommy, Officer Timothy saved us," Maya said, her voice full of pride. "He found our special signals," Emma added, "just like Daddy taught us." Timothy felt something shift inside him as he held this small family. The crushing guilt he'd carried since his daughter's death began to loosen its grip. In its place, a warm sense of purpose and fulfillment bloomed. These precious girls were safe. He hadn't failed them. He hadn't failed Rachel. "Thank you," Rachel whispered, meeting his eyes over the girls' heads. "Thank you for bringing them back to me." Timothy couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. He just nodded, holding them all closer as tears of healing flowed freely down his cheeks. In this moment, surrounded by the love of this reunited family, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: peace. Weeks passed, and the Evans house transformed from a place of fear into one filled with joy and healing. Timothy's patrol car became a familiar sight in the driveway, parked there several evenings a week after his shift ended. On this particular evening, Timothy balanced on a ladder in the living room, replacing the broken light fixture that had bothered Rachel for months. The sounds of Maya and Emma's giggles drifted up from below as they held their flashlights steady for him. "Officer Timothy, can you see better now?" Maya called up, her beam of light wobbling as she bounced on her toes. "Perfect, sweetheart," he answered, carefully connecting the last wire. "Emma, your light is right where I need it." Rachel watched from the doorway, a soft smile on her face as she dried her hands on a dish towel. The kitchen smelled of fresh-baked cookies, a thank you for Timothy's help with the endless list of repairs Michael had never gotten around to finishing. "All done," Timothy announced, climbing down the ladder. He flipped the switch, and warm light flooded the room. The twins clapped and cheered as if he'd performed a magic trick. "Can we play hide-and-seek now?" Emma asked, tugging at his sleeve. "You promised." Timothy glanced at Rachel, who nodded her permission. "Go ahead. Dinner's still got 20 minutes. The girls squealed with delight as Timothy covered his eyes and began counting. Their little feet thundered up the stairs as they searched for hiding spots. This had become their favorite game with him, though he suspected they sometimes let him find them just to surprise him with their giggly ambushes. As Timothy moved through the house calling out playfully, "Where are those silly girls hiding?" Rachel watched him with grateful eyes. The darkness that had haunted him when they first met had lifted. Here, in their home, surrounded by children's laughter and simple moments of joy, Timothy seemed to have found something he'd been missing. Later that evening, after another successful round of hide-and-seek and a warm dinner together, Timothy sat on the floor helping the twins build a tower with their blocks. The setting sun painted the living room golden, and the new light fixture cast a cozy glow over their little gathering. "Higher!" Maya encouraged as Timothy carefully placed another block. "Careful," Emma warned, always the more cautious one. The tower swayed slightly but held firm, just like the new sense of family that had grown between them all. Timothy felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. For the first time in years, the memory of his daughter didn't bring sharp pain. Instead, it felt like she would have been happy to see him here, helping these little girls build towers and find their smiles again. The community center buzzed with excitement as people gathered for what they called Timothy's Day. Colorful streamers hung from the ceiling, and hand-painted banners decorated the walls. Children ran between tables filled with homemade dishes while their parents chatted animatedly about the man of the hour. Timothy stood near the entrance, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment at all the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, preferring to work quietly in the background. Rachel stood beside him, gently encouraging him to accept the community's gratitude. "Officer Timothy! Officer Timothy!" Two familiar voices called out in unison. Maya and Emma pushed through the crowd, clutching something behind their backs. Their matching blue dresses swished as they bounced with excitement. "We made something for you," Emma said shyly. Maya nodded eagerly. "Close your eyes." Timothy knelt down to their level and closed his eyes, feeling a paper card being pressed into his hands. When he opened them, he found himself staring at a handmade card covered in glitter and crayon drawings. In wobbly letters across the top it read, "Our Hero," with a drawing of Timothy in his police uniform standing between two small figures he recognized as the twins. His vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. The simple words touched something deep in his heart, and he pulled both girls into a gentle hug. Mrs. Andrews, who had first spotted the suspicious car that night, stood up to share her story. "Timothy's bravery didn't just save Maya and Emma," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It showed us all what one person can do when they refuse to look the other way. Because of him, our neighborhood watch program has doubled in size." Other community members stood up to share their own stories. Mr. Peterson, the grocery store owner, told how Timothy's example inspired him to help a family whose car had broken down late one night. Sarah from the library shared how she'd found the courage to report suspicious activity she'd witnessed, leading to the prevention of another crime. "Timothy reminded us that we're stronger when we stand together," Rachel addressed the crowd, her voice full of emotion. "He showed us that one person's courage can inspire an entire community." Timothy listened to each story, overwhelmed by the impact his actions had on others. He hadn't done any of it for recognition. He'd simply followed his heart and refused to give up on two little girls who needed him. But seeing how his determination had rippled through the community, inspiring others to be braver and kinder, filled him with a profound sense of purpose. The twins stayed close to Timothy throughout the celebration, proudly showing off their card to anyone who would look. Their small hands kept finding their way back to his, as if reassuring themselves that their hero was still there, still watching over them. One warm evening, the evening sun cast long shadows across Rachel's front porch as she and Timothy sat on the wooden swing. The gentle creaking of its chains provided a soothing rhythm to their conversation. Inside, Maya and Emma's laughter drifted through the screen door as they played with their toys. Rachel wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of tea and turned to Timothy. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you," she said softly. "What you did for us, it went so far beyond duty." Timothy's eyes remained fixed on the setting sun. "I couldn't let them down," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not like—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "Your daughter," Rachel finished gently. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "You know, Maya and Emma talk about you constantly now. You're not just the officer who saved them, you've become family to them." Timothy's shoulders relaxed at her words. "Being here with all of you, it's helping me heal too," he admitted. "For so long, I carried this weight of failure, but seeing their smiles, hearing their laughter," he gestured toward the house. "It reminds me there's still good in the world." Rachel nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Trauma changes us," she said. "After Michael died, I thought I'd never feel safe again. But watching how you fought for us, how you refused to give up even when everyone else had," she paused, wiping away a tear. "It showed me that we don't have to face our fears alone." The swing swayed gently as they sat in comfortable silence. The sound of crickets began to fill the evening air. "You know," Timothy said finally, "I used to drive by this house just hoping to see those little faces in the window. Now being here, being part of your lives—" He turned to face Rachel, his eyes sincere. "It feels like more than friendship. It feels like family," Rachel finished, her voice warm and certain. "Because that's what we are now. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands by you when the world feels darkest." Timothy felt something shift in his heart, a piece of his broken past finally finding its place in this unexpected present. The bond he felt with Rachel and the twins had grown into something deep and meaningful, something that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. The police department's conference room buzzed with anticipation. Timothy stood at the front, his uniform pressed and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The room was packed with fellow officers, community members, and most importantly to him, Rachel and the twins sitting in the front row. Captain Reynolds stepped up to the podium, his expression softer than usual. "Today, we honor Officer Timothy Evans for extraordinary bravery and dedication above and beyond the call of duty," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed room. When others hesitated, when the path seemed unclear, Officer Evans followed his instincts and his heart. Timothy's mind flashed back to those who had doubted him, who had warned him away from investigating Victor Hale. Now, many of those same officers sat before him, their faces showing respect and admiration. Detective Martinez, who had been one of the strongest voices against Timothy's investigation, stood up. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I let fear cloud my judgment. Timothy showed us what real police work looks like, protecting those who need us most, no matter the cost." When Timothy finally took the podium, he looked down at Maya and Emma's smiling faces. Their presence gave him strength as he began to speak. "Years ago, I lost my daughter," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "I carried that loss like a shield, thinking it would protect me from feeling that kind of pain again. But it was actually a wall, keeping me from doing what I was meant to do, helping others." He paused, taking a deep breath. "When I saw those empty windows where Maya and Emma used to wave at me every morning, something broke inside me. But this time, instead of letting the fear win, I let it drive me. Because that's what we're here for, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them." Several officers nodded, some wiping away tears. Timothy continued, "We wear these badges not for power or authority, but as a promise to protect the vulnerable. Every child who waves at us from their porch, every person who turns to us in their darkest hour, they're counting on us to keep that promise." Maya and Emma suddenly broke protocol and ran up to Timothy, wrapping their arms around his legs. Instead of stopping them, Captain Reynolds smiled, understanding that this moment perfectly illustrated Timothy's message. Timothy placed his hands gently on their shoulders, embodying the very protection he spoke about. "This badge," Timothy said, his voice growing stronger, "isn't just a piece of metal. It's a commitment to be there when others need us most, to never let fear or doubt stop us from doing what's right. That's what defines us, not our fears, but our courage to overcome them for others." The room erupted in applause, with officers standing one by one until the entire audience was on their feet. Timothy's words had touched something deep within them all, reminding them of their true purpose as protectors of their community. The morning sun painted the neighborhood in soft golden light as Timothy's patrol car turned onto the familiar street. His heart swelled as he spotted two small figures bouncing excitedly on the porch of the White House with blue shutters. "Officer Timothy! Officer Timothy!" Maya and Emma called out in unison, their matching pigtails swinging as they jumped up and down, waving with both hands. Timothy slowed the car and rolled down his window, grinning broadly. "Good morning, my favorite twins," he called back. The sight of them, safe and happy, still brought tears to his eyes sometimes. Rachel appeared in the doorway behind them, holding two lunchboxes. She gave Timothy a warm smile and a small wave of her own. These morning greetings had become even more special now, a daily reminder of everything they'd overcome together. Later that evening, Timothy returned after his shift. The twins were finishing their homework at the kitchen table while Rachel prepared dinner. The familiar sounds of pencils scratching paper and pots clattering in the kitchen filled the house with comfortable domesticity. As the sun began to set, Rachel joined Timothy on the porch. They stood side by side, watching the sky turn from blue to brilliant orange. The twins' laughter drifted through the screen door behind them as they played with their dolls. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky we are," Rachel said softly, wrapping her arms around herself in the cooling evening air. Without hesitation, Timothy placed his jacket around her shoulders. "I'm the lucky one," Timothy replied, his voice gentle. "You three gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A family." Through the window they could see Maya showing Emma how to braid her doll's hair, their heads bent together in concentration. The sight made Rachel's eyes well up with happy tears. "You know," she said, "the girls asked me this morning if they could start calling you Uncle Timothy." Timothy's breath caught in his throat. He remembered the countless times he'd driven past this house, aching with loneliness, never imagining he'd find such belonging here. The screen door creaked open, and two pairs of small feet padded onto the porch. "Uncle Timothy," Maya said, testing out the new name with a shy smile. "Will you help us build a pillow fort?" Emma nodded eagerly beside her sister. Please? Mom can join too. Timothy looked at Rachel, who was beaming at her daughters. The last rays of sunlight caught the tears in her eyes, making them sparkle. This was what healing looked like: pillow forts and sunset conversations, morning waves and shared laughter. "I'd love nothing more," Timothy answered, his heart full to bursting as the twins each grabbed one of his hands, pulling him back into the warmth of their home. The evening air was gentle as Timothy sat on the porch steps. Maya and Emma settled on either side of him. The wooden board still held the day's warmth, making it cozy as the sun dipped lower in the sky. "Tell us about Sarah again," Maya said softly, leaning her head against Timothy's arm. Emma nodded in agreement, her eyes wide with interest. Timothy's heart, which once would have shattered at the mention of his daughter's name, now felt tender but strong. "Sarah loved butterflies," he began, his voice warm with memory. "She used to say they were proof that beautiful changes could happen even when things seemed dark. Like how the caterpillar turns into a butterfly?" Emma asked, twisting a strand of her hair thoughtfully. "Exactly like that," Timothy smiled. "She taught me that hope is like those butterfly wings, delicate but powerful enough to carry you anywhere." Maya hugged her knees to her chest. "Do you think Sarah would have liked us?" "Oh, sweetheart," Timothy's voice caught slightly. "She would have adored you both. You remind me of her sometimes. Your bravery, your kindness." The screen door creaked softly as Rachel stepped out onto the porch. She placed a gentle hand on Timothy's shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her touch spread through him like sunshine. "I heard you talking about butterflies," Rachel said, settling down beside them. "Did you know we have some chrysalises in the garden? We've been watching them, waiting for them to open." "Just like we waited for you to find us," Emma said, reaching for Timothy's hand. Timothy squeezed her small fingers, remembering those desperate days of searching. But now, sitting here surrounded by love and laughter, those dark memories seemed to fade like shadows in the morning light. Maya giggled at something Emma whispered, and soon all four of them were laughing together. The sound echoed through the house behind them, filling every corner with joy. Timothy looked around at their smiling faces, at the home that had welcomed him into its heart, and knew with absolute certainty that this was where he belonged. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Timothy, Rachel, Maya, and Emma, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.